Hello pen people, I've been asked to do a video on the Noodlers Boston Safety pen, and so what I have here to show you are a black one, which was the original release, and then later Nathan Tardif came out with the chestnut, and I have a vintage one, one from roughly 100 years ago, and then this is a fairly new release. This came out for the Commonwealth Pen show. Nathan had a few made in this blue acrylic. It came in just a little cellophane sleeve. The others come in a cardboard box, but the nice thing about Nathan Tardif's products is you don't have to hold on to a big stupid box like some other pen companies that that increase the value of the pen by their packaging. But anyway, these are interesting pens. As you can see, these Boston Safety pens are sort of a reproduction of these very old safety pens from Moore was the pen maker. They work by very simple means. They have inside a thin ebonite shaft that is protected by that little collar that goes right there, and you operate it by pushing and pulling out the nib from here, and it's a very simple design and very effective. And there are other safety pen designs that are a bit more complicated. I've shown them before, but I don't know that I've ever taken one apart. And I have one here that maybe I'll do that on so that you can get an idea of what the other types of safety pens are. So basically, for safety pens 100 years ago, there were the Moore or Boston type, and then there were the more common Waterman or Continental type. This is a Continental. It's made by Columbus of Italy. It is, again, a very old pen. Not as old as the Moore, but it is old. And they have the same kind of look to them, where you've got no nib when you take the cap off, and then when you twist, these ones are different. You twist this knob at the bottom, and the nib comes out. And the way that works is inside they have a very complicated... Oh, come on, don't jam up on me. There we go. It takes a little bit to work these things out. If you remove the collar without twisting the nib at the same time, you can bind up the helix. And this is the helix. This is the way these work is there's a channel carved into the barrel, and that this little rod rides on, this little rod of ebonite. And then as you twist the knob down below, and the knob is this thin part right here, not this collar piece. And as you twist that little knob, the helix turns, and this little shaft right there rides up and down on the inside of that notch inside the barrel. And as you can see, this is all ebonite, which means it's very fragile, and it's very, very thin. I don't know how easy it is for you to see how thin that is, but you can imagine that if you twisted this too hard, you could snap this, and they tend to break at the base here, like right here or through one of the helix pieces, and occasionally I've seen them broken up at the top. So these are much more complicated than the type that Nathan chose to reproduce, which is this Boston type. They are very simple, and what's really cool about this one here is that you get to see how they work from the inside. You can take these apart, and Nathan has in one of his videos, but I think it's really nice in this that you can see what he's talking about. So one of the interesting features of the pens is that this cap has a steel rod. It's a stainless steel rod. And the reason it's there is you can imagine that if you have the nib out like this and you tried to cap it, you could crush that nib. But because that rod is there, it indexes into the feed in that little slot, and you can see that it goes in there, and then when you push on it, it will retract the nib for you. And then as you screw it down, it'll continue to push the nib in without allowing it to hit the inside of the cap. That is a feature that none of these Continental ones have, and I have seen quite a few of them where somebody just capped it and they just crushed and twisted the nib and it was ruined. The nibs are fairly small and fine. It's very common to see these where there have been damage that's been repaired. This one's got a little bit of a ripple to it, and that may be because it was repaired at one time and it was bent and repaired because somebody tried to cap it without retracting it. Anyway, these have that nice safety feature, and it's something that was also on these old ones. I don't know if, yeah, you probably can't see it deep down in there, but there is also a steel rod on that one that will push the nib back in, which is great. Anyway, so as you could see, there's a rod and the nice thing about these things, these Noodler pens, and this is something that I think is pretty awesome about them, is that they're a tinkerer's pen. You can mess around with them all you want, and you can take them apart and clean them, fix them, whatever you want to do. And you see that you can take the cap apart even. That may be important if you get some ink inside the cap and you want to clean it out. Sometimes ink likes to work its way into the threads, and you can clean that out. Anyway, this, like the old Boston Safeties, has a collar that comes off, and then here you have the working parts of the pen. Now on these old ones, this one has been restored. It's got a new actually, let me use one that's a little easier to work on. This very long one is actually really rare. So I think it's interesting that Nathan reproduced these very long ones, because they're actually, in the wild, these old ones are actually pretty rare. Most of them are of a much smaller size. This one is about the fattest you will find of any of these types. This is, I mean, they're the same brand. This is a different model, and you can see that it's thicker. Let me just take this one apart quickly, and you can see what the differences are between the two. So here we have a collar comes off as well, just like that one. We have a collar and a cap. And so these are the same sort of working unit. Push in on that, and the nib comes out. Very, very similar looking design. But they differ in how they come apart. So to take one of these old ones apart, you take this knob off the back, and then you push, and then it pops past the collar up here at the end, and you gently pull it out, and then you have your nib and feed and shaft. And this one, it doesn't work like that. You actually don't have to take the knob off to get it apart. You unscrew this collar, and that retains the two O-rings in there that form the seal. And that has come apart, and you can then clean and grease the seals, whatever you need to do, and then put it back together, and I'll do that in a moment. But one of the interesting things about this one that I should note is, did you see the drastic difference there? The original ones had a thin ebonite shaft. What that did is it allowed for maximum ink capacity inside that barrel. However, I'm assuming that they probably were fairly fragile. The Noodler's pen was designed to be used by people and taken apart and tinkered with, essentially. And I think that had they made the shafts that thin, there would probably be a lot of breakage with people working on them. But the one thing that's odd about them is that it's a three-piece shaft, whereas this one, it's basically a shaft that widens. It's actually all one piece, and then there is an extra piece here this is the like a collar around the nib that is pushed down over the rest of it, and the shaft itself is the feed that feeds the nib from under here. I'm sure that's a lot of very delicate machine work that had to be done. They had to cut this piece out of a larger piece of ebonite and then taper it down for this piece and then thread it, and then up here the feed was actually made part of the end of this with the feed channels cut in it. Anyway, so there's a lot of delicate machine work involved in that one. This one, it's a bit different. You have Noodler's little ebonite feeds, kind of like they do with the Charlie pen and others, that it's stuffed into this first piece, which is the collar, which it too had some delicate work done on it. They had to taper it here, and then they had to cut this chamber in here. They had to drill all these little holes to let the ink get in there, and that's the one place where I think that these pens probably don't work quite as well as their ancestors, because I don't think the ink flows through those tiny little holes quite as well as could be hoped. I have found that when I've used my pens, that occasionally I have to shake it to get the ink back down into that little chamber there to feed the nib. But then there's this coupler here, and then that is put together with this shaft. On a lot of the ebonite ones, Nathan always recommends people that when you push the nib out, and a lot of times there'll be some stiction where it just won't push, and he says to twist it to the right before you push it out. And what that does is it makes sure that this collar here doesn't unscrew from the shaft, and because if you twist it the other way, you could be unscrewing this. On this one, it's obviously been glued, which is probably a good idea for strength, and because then you won't be loosening it up on the inside of the pen when you're messing around with it. The barrel is just a simple barrel. It looks like it has some grease or something in there. That is not. That's the remnants of the machining process. It looked like silicone grease or something in there to me, but I've cleaned it, and that's not what it is. To put them back together, it's fairly simple. You put the shaft and everything back inside the pen, and then using this collar, you push those O-rings in. And I just put some silicone grease on that before I took it apart, so I'm not worried about lubricating it right now. But if you need to, you just throw some silicone grease in there. And I like to use these syringes to put it. It allows you to easily apply it without getting it all over yourself, your fingers, and then transferring it to the rest of the pen. So you screw that collar in, and the collar retains those O-rings. And then that's it. The pen works. And then throw the cap together. These vintage ones are a little bit different. You have to, again, feed them in through the top, just like you took it out. And you have to gently put it in there, and you have to feel for where it will go through the seals in the base there. And I found that if I twist it so that the threads at the base of that shaft can work their way through the seal, that it works best, and then it pops through, and I can feel it when it pops through. And then you have to pop it through again. There we go. So that the collar pops past the tighten spot right here that keeps the pen from leaking. And then gently push it down a little bit, and then there you go. Again, a very, very simple design. Far simpler and easier to repair than the old Helix type. Now, these are a little bit different. There's like a washer in here that looks like a washer, rather. It's another piece of ebonite that is actually threaded, and it threads into threads that are right here. And then normally there's a section of cork in here that's about that long. On this one, somebody had replaced like half of that cork, and it was leaking still. So I cleaned out all of the cork, and I replaced it with O-rings, and so it works really well now. There's a bit more drag to it when you push it in and out, which I don't mind. Occasionally you can put some silicone grease on here and allow that to work, but it's working just fine now. So let's ink up this Boston Safety pen, and we'll even ink up this old more, and we'll show you how they're a little bit different and how they work. So I haven't inked this one up yet, as you can tell. I mean, there would have been ink all over the place. I'll use some of this Gerbon. I don't even know how to pronounce that. Bleu Provence or something like that. And you can use an eyedropper. I think this is the eyedropper that came with one of my stipulas, one of those Passaportos. And I don't remember how much Nathan said these things can hold, but it's not as much as I had expected. So this is a small amount of ink. This is, maybe a half a mil. And you squeeze it in there. And as you can see, it works its way down. And that was not that much ink, and it's almost full. The thing about that fat shaft, that thick shaft in there, is that it fills up most of the barrel, and there's not much more room for ink. And maybe a half. And I don't want to go past there because it tends to throw the ink out if it has more than that in it. We'll cap it for a moment, and I'll show you why. I like to cap it, get it nice and tight, and then tip it down so that the ink has a chance to get all over that feed and inside that nib, to fill it up as much as possible. And then I'll tap it down so that when I open it up, ink doesn't come out. Well, actually, when I extend the nib. And so now we'll extend the nib, and you see, because the tolerances are so tight there, and that collar is so wide, it tends to carry a bunch of the ink up with it. There it goes. Now the meniscus broke and it went down. And there it goes. And if you're worried that it's going to leak, we'll show you what happens when you tip it down. Nothing. So it does seal very well right there. The ink isn't just going to pour out when you tip it down. And so this is, and I'm reaching around the camera here, so my writing isn't going to be great. This is the, oh, it's not going to want to write for me. Come on, what's going on? Put a little ink on the nib there. Wow, I have to say this nib is actually really smooth. I'm pressing down fairly hard because I want to see how it feels with the bounce that this nib has. It's a steel flex nib. It doesn't have a ton of bounce, but you can flex it, and the feed runs dry. Shake it a little bit. Yeah, and so that's kind of the issue I have. It's not as, this is worse than the ebonite ones. The ebonite ones tend to have better ink flow, just because ebonite always will. It will always flow better than acrylic will. And getting the ink, and see now if I tap it, I can force ink to come out, which is kind of irritating. But it still doesn't want to write. And it may take some time. Sometimes the pens just need, to be used a bit and get used to the ink flow and stuff. But I think it has something to do with all those tiny little holes in the bottom of that ink collar, and it's just the ink not getting in there. I'm trying to see, and the ink is dark enough that I can't really see those little holes in there, but I don't know. Anyway, let's ink up one of the other ones. Let's ink up the black one here and see if that writes a little better. Actually, this one has had Bay State Blue in it. Let's use Bay State Blue. Just for, I'm not wanting to mix the inks. Bay State Blue is not one that plays well with others. And I'm going to tap a little bit to break the meniscus and get it down inside as much as possible. More Bay State Blue. For those of you who do or don't like Bay State Blue, it's one of those inks that's very divisive as far as how people feel about it. I've always kind of liked it. I like the shocking blue quality of it. I like that it's bleach resistant. The one thing I found out about it, though, see, ebonite just works better. It's hygroscopic, or whatever they say. Water tends to cling to it and flow down it, and so it works better. I think that the acrylic one is a nice, it's nice to be able to see what's going on inside there. However, the acrylic itself isn't a great friend to ink. And you see there how the ink will just roll off of it and it beads up on it. If it were ebonite, and there's no such thing as clear ebonite, but if there were, you would see that the ink would just evenly coat everything and would stay on there. And that's just part of the nature of it, and that's why ink tends to flow better on it. And as you can see, this pen works great. I've never really had issues with this pen. Just occasionally, after writing a few pages with it, it starts to run a little dry, and then I'll have to tap it a little bit to get some ink back down into that chamber. So if you want to buy one of these pens to use, I would say get one of the ebonite ones. They work better. But it's kind of fun to have one of the clear ones to mess around with and show what it looks like. And I might try and see if I can tweak this one a little bit to make it work better. But they're decent pens. Now I will ink up one of these vintage ones. And this one's actually a really good little pen. We'll use this. This one's completely cleaned out. I could put whatever ink I wanted into it. Now, I've just put enough ink in it that would completely fill up that bigger Boston Safety pen, the Noodlers. But this one, and we've got 2 in there. I still can't see the ink in it. Let's go. There we go. a little over 2. So it holds more ink despite being much smaller. Nib, size comparison. It's a smaller pen, but it holds more ink, just because of the size of that operating shaft on the inside. Look at the base tape, like how it coats that nib. I think it's really cool. Anyway, this pen is a lovely pen to write with. It flows fantastically. It flexes beautifully. That was me because I lifted up. That's why it skipped. This pen is just it's a fantastic user pen. Just a great little thing. So if you're out there and you're in the market for one of these pens, personally, I would go vintage. I love these things. They are great pens. The Noodlers pens are good too. I mean, it's a good writer. The price differential is considerable, honestly. I think these are running for $55 right now. The Noodlers ones are, and these these more Boston Safeties. I've been buying ones that have been broken, that need a lot of work, new seals. Sometimes other things are wrong with them. I have one, for example, where the collar was broken, and I was able to put it together and put a brass sleeve over it to keep it together. So I buy them fairly inexpensively, but restored and in good condition, they can sell for hundreds. This big one right here that's in such great shape, I'm sure it's worth over $250, maybe even $300 right now. But I mean, it's just because of the exquisite condition that it's in. Anyway, but if you're in the market for one, you don't shy away from one of these Noodlers, but just realize that these are tinker pens. They're ones that you'll mess around with. You may have to do some adjustments to them to get them to work properly, just like all of the other Noodlers pens. But like I say, this one right here, this particular one, I've had no issues with. It writes well, writes all the time. But it's not a pen that you want to use. That I personally would use every single day because it's kind of fiddly. So, you pull your pen out, you want to take some quick notes, you've got to unscrew the cap, you've got to push the nib out, and then you can write. And then pull it back in, put the cap back on. And the worst thing is, if you forget and you tip it accidentally at one point, the meniscus on these is pretty strong because there's not much room. But the ink will just pour out. So it's not necessarily one you'll just hand to somebody to use because they could make a terrible mess of it and a mess of their clothing and of the floor and everything else. But if you want to mess around with an old safety pen, these new ones are good. And I hope that's enough information for all of you who've been asking questions about them. If you have particular questions, just make comments below. Thanks.